Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Wilder podcast. How are you, Tom?
I'm good. I mean, just about getting all the mud from out of the nooks and crevices that it's getting in at the moment. But other than that, pretty good.
Oh, there is way too much mud at the moment where we live. Following the excavations of last week's episode, we have excavated way too much mud over our hard standing to be, it's like a swamp getting the kids from the car into the house, which is doing nothing for my house pride. Is that the right word?
Our house pride.
Yeah, our house pride.
Yeah. No, it is. It's got to the point where I literally pick them up from the kitchen door and carry them to the car because they just want to get their school shoes muddy by the time they get there, because we've excavated exactly the right amount of mud in order to achieve the mission of what we want to do with the cables and everything else. But the problem is that's going to be an enduring issue for this season. Now we're now into the muddy season and we've not helped it by making more mud.
The dogs are definitely not allowed outside anymore.
They're inside dogs.
Yeah.
Little dog litter in the corner. Yeah, so that was good.
I guess I'm curious because there's been a lot of rain over the last week or so. And what have you noticed, Tom, about the effects of that rain?
This is a leading question, Chloe, and I resent that. Last week, listeners will remember that I was very proud of my digger activities around the land, channeling my inner spirit animal, which is a wild boar, in order just to, again, start that defielding process, uncovering or taking off the top level of grass, uncovering the dirt and soil underneath to allow, hopefully in the future, seeds, etc., to germinate. Now, I stopped at the point, I knew what a wild boar looks like and what kind of effect it has on the land, so I stopped when I thought I'd achieved it. But what I didn't really realise or appreciate is the amount of mud that gets kind of spread over perfectly fine grass. And it looks like you've had more of an effect on the ground than you have. But then as soon as it rained recently, it's just basically washed all the mud off the perfectly healthy grass that I haven't managed to remove. And so it's probably about a third less effective than I was expecting. So lesson learned for next time, be more destructive.
And I guess also shows just how resilient grass is. Like, it's amazing stuff. It just keeps on coming.
It's all right, not next time, Chloe. Got it covered.
Excellent. I think the other thing that we've been away for a week and we just come back. The other thing we were excited to check out is some of our leaky woody debris. Have I got that right?
Correct. You wouldn't let me talk about this last week, which I thought would be really interesting, but we
don't want to talk too much last time.
We did. You know what about that? It's been really nice, the response we've had from people about that episode.
Yeah. How
they've really appreciated the journey and us talking open and honestly about it. For those people that have reached out and responded like that, I really appreciate the feedback. Thank you very much. If anyone didn't like it, feel free to give us constructive feedback going forward as well, because that's what we like. hello@grangeproject.co.uk. So back to leaky woody debris. I know it's exciting stuff, that's right. So Tom from Natural Resources Wales reached out and said, look, Tom and Chloe, we've got some funding. My mission is to reduce the risk of flooding in populated areas. Can I come and create some leaky woody debris on your land in order to achieve that? Having absolutely no knowledge or expectation of what he was talking about, we were like, yeah, come on then, let's crack on. So Tom turned up with his chainsaw wielding partner and proceeded to give us essentially a masterclass in leaky woody debris, and it was a really great day.
Before we go any further, Tom, can you just explain what on earth leaky woody debris is?
I'll do my best. Maybe we should step it back a bit. So when Tom originally suggested it, when we were talking about it together, we were talking about, well, is this going to increase biodiversity? Because that's what we're interested in. How do we help protect the ecology of the planet, right? That's what we're trying to do, or increase it and improve it. And this leaky woody debris really is designed to mitigate flood risk further down the river. At the time, I didn't think it was in line with increasing biodiversity on the land. But you came up with a really fair point, which was...
It's like a beaver?
No.
Humans as part of the ecology.
Humans are part of the ecosystem and therefore protecting. Yeah, okay, fine. So humans are part of the ecosystem. And I was like, yeah, all right, fair one. Can't argue with that. So that's when we invited Tom and his chainsaw wielding friend over. And it was a masterclass in it. And essentially, it's taking natural wood adjacent to the streams and where you think water may flow during a extreme weather event, and creating essentially like speed bumps that when it's normal weather, normal raining, normal stream, it doesn't interfere with the water flow at all. And it's quite bizarre watching them put it in, because they'll put it in and the water just keep flowing over. That's that done. Okay, let's move on to the next one. You're like, well, hang on, it's done nothing. Why should you put this in? But it's there for those extreme weather events so that when it does get torrential, it will increase the water flow to those streams. The streams, of course, will then increase in height and speed. It will then hit the leaky woody debris and essentially back up and delaying that torrent of water down and create mini dams like a beaver. And then eventually those mini dams will then overflow, and then it will go down to the next leaky woody debris, which will then become a mini dam and then overflow and move on. And what we are doing by creating up to 30 or 40 of these installations on the land is by delaying the flow from our stream down to the rivers and beyond into the built up areas. So if Tom can achieve this on other farms around the area, there's a real chance it will make a big difference to reducing the risk of flooding for the human inhabitants of Monmouthshire.
And what about any benefits for biodiversity in association with that?
Yeah, let's ask an ecologist. But
come on, you're going to give it a stab.
Well, my stab is it essentially is behaving like a beaver, and so so anything we can do to create that areas for increased kind of small ponds or scrapes, even for small periods, I think will only help. So
there's something about wet is good for biodiversity, and if we're even slightly slowing water down, then we're going to have more wet, which is better habitat for a wider range of invertebrate and plant life, etc., etc.
Yeah, we definitely need to speak to ecologists when they come here, because I think we're not doing it justice. There's definitely, just watching it, you can see there's more habitats being built because of these leaky woody debris. And coming on from that, again, in line with the main effort for Grange Project, Tom and his team are coming back to run courses now in creating the leaky woody debris, etc., in February and beyond, for people to help them understand the value that it brings. So now that hopefully will be our first educational course run off from the Grange Project.
Which is very exciting. I'm getting ready. My baking's getting ready. I'm getting prepared.
So, I mean, that was gone on for longer than we were expecting, but hopefully people have found that particularly interesting.
Well, if not, they can have hopefully skipped it by just going straight to the start of the interview.
No one skips this bit. This is the X factor.
Well, I'm not sure. I think for this particular episode, our interview with Lynn is absolutely fantastic. I was just listening back to it before we recorded this bit.
Listen back to yourself. I mean, that's a bit egotistical.
You're the podcaster. You told me I've got to listen to learn about how I can do podcasting better. But Lynn is such a fantastic example of someone that is able to really articulate in such an engaging way both their journey, and she had so much kind of wisdom, and I learned loads from the conversation. It's probably for me been the one that's kind of resonated with me most today in terms of, and also generated the most thinking about what we're trying to do here and what that means, and I left very inspired from the conversation.
Yeah, Lynn and Sandra are 7 years along a similar journey of what we're hoping to take. So, and I think if we can have half the knowledge that they've got in 7 years' time, I'll be extremely proud of our journey. So I think they've done an amazing job, and this is a wonderful interview.
So to give the formal introduction, this is Lynn from Lynbreck Croft, and she and her partner Sandra have been regenerating at Lynbreck Croft for the last 7 years, and their story is glorious, and I really hope you enjoy it. So good morning, Lynn. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here today with us. I am so delighted that you've joined us today because I've been reading your book. I feel a little bit starstruck to meet someone who's authored such a fantastic piece of work that I've really, really enjoyed reading. But for our listeners that might not be aware of you and the work at Lynbreck Croft, could you just talk a little bit about who you are and where you find yourself?
Firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to be on your podcast. It's a real privilege to meet you both virtually, and also to find a little bit more about your project and what you're trying to achieve, which is really inspirational and exciting to learn about. And it's really a very similar journey to what we've been on here at Lynbreck Croft over the last 7.5 years. So the kind of story starts really back in 2012, which is when my partner Sandra and I met. We were living and working just on the edge of London at a big National Trust estate called Clifton on the edge of Maidenhead. And we were there living and working there as rangers. Outdoor job, really loved what we were doing, but felt this kind of strong draw to the land, really wanting to live a kind of a slower, quieter place of life, but really connect with nature. So we did what I describe as, what your parents tell you never to do, which is quit our jobs, two really nice jobs, and moved north to Scotland, which is where Sandra's mum's from. So there was a bit of a family connection. And we spent 2 years living and working in the borders of Scotland, really as tree planters. And that was our first transition from working in the world of conservation to now working in the world of rewilding, which was completely new to us. So we started to read works by people like, George Monbiot. So we read Feral by George Monbiot and, just completely loved what he'd written. And that book really impacted us. We'd started to question what we were eating, shifting much more away from buying, meat in the supermarket to maybe only hill shot venison, just all those sorts of things. Started to become quite critical of farming. Started to see what George Monbiot would talk about, the sheep-wrecked landscapes that we were working in, reforesting. And anyway, that was kind of happening in the background. And in the meantime, because we were in Scotland, we now had an opportunity to go and look for some land. So long and short of it is we've spent about 8 months, found nothing. Well, we did find one little place which was far too big and far too expensive. But anyway, we shelved that. But it kept niggling. And so one day we realised we were going to be driving right past this particular land holding, which turns out was Lynbreck Croft. And we arrived there for the first time, I think it was about late August, early September 2015, and really kind of fell in love with it. 150 acre land holding, very mixed bag of what would be described as in-by fields. So we've got about 6 hectares maybe of in-by fields. Then we have about 3 hectares of woodland, and the rest is a mixture of bog and upland, so heather hillside. So I guess what I'm trying to paint a picture of you here is that if you were to look at this landscape with maybe kind of traditional farming or traditional agricultural eyes, it would look pretty much rubbish. But to us, it was the land of milk and honey. We saw this incredible biodiversity, an opportunity to kind of grow that in this stunning location in the Cairngorms National Park, you know, on the edge of the Cairngorms Massif. And that's when I often think naivety can get you very far in life. So we did everything, again, that you're told you never should do. So we put all of our eggs in one basket, quite literally, emptied every single pot of cash that we had with some, you know, help from dear friends and family, and moved to Lynbreck in March 2016. And the kind of the story then continues from there, which has been one into learning how to grow our own food, learning how to set up a small scale farming business after being very critical of farming. We find that this is exactly what we're doing, producing meat, which is really high quality, which is biodiversity enhancing. And then using all of our learning to really have conversations with people, to try and show people, you know, what it's like to live and work off the land, but also share our learnings of reconnecting with nature and the power of food and the power of the health that can give you. So that's it in a nutshell.
Right, I'm already packing my bags. I'm coming to visit. I'm sorry.
We're full.
And like you said earlier about, you did this in order to get a quieter, slower pace of life. Now, our most recent episode where I mentioned that, we've never been busier in terms of, I think we're juggling a lot at the moment. Have you achieved this quieter, slower pace of life, or is it just different?
No, and different is the answer. So I think what we found, and what a lot of people, in fact, I would say pretty much everybody that's come here has found, is that this is a very inspiring place, in that, the landscape is big, the opportunities are endless. And so you can't help but come here and think, you could do this, you could do this, we could do that, you could do this, you could do this. And obviously, if you had an endless pot of money and 48 hours in each day, then yes, you could maybe achieve even just a small percentage of that. So we find that everybody that comes here tends to kind of have this, oh my goodness, look at all this potential. And I think we've definitely moved here and thought, oh my goodness, look at all this potential. So the first 7.5 years here have been very, very, very busy. We've put in fencing, we've brought on animals, we've built buildings, we've planted, over 30,000 trees, we've hosted tour groups, we've hosted courses, we've grown our own food, we've put in a butchery, we butcher our own animals, I could go on. And I think, where we're at now that we've got everything set up, it's transitioning to a point where you're saying, okay, busy is good, but full is better. So busy can be manic, busy can be crazy, busy can be unstructured, but full can give high outputs, but in a way which is much more kind of balanced and measured. So, and I'm not saying that in any way that I'm being kind of critical or regret of anything that we've done. Everything that we've done has been incredible. But it's like life, isn't it? It journeys and it transitions and it moves from one phase to the next. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now.
You really take a view of what you're doing and make sure you're optimizing.
Well, that's right. And philosophers have philosophized about this through the years, saying, for everything from modern day messages of, what is it, work smarter, not harder, or, all these kind of things, people have been talking about it for years. And I think they're all really great messages, but you have to get to the point where you're ready to do that and make that transition. So, yeah.
I guess I'm curious, if I was sitting here speaking to the kind of Lynn and Sandra of 10 years ago, and we were talking about what you're doing now, what would be surprising you most about what you're doing now in comparison to what you intended to do when you started looking for Lynbreck Croft?
So I can only answer that really from my own personal perspective. Sandra would probably tell you something different. But for me, it's probably the farming element is quite a surprise. I never really put myself in that bracket or envisaged myself going down that route. The vision that I had back in the day, which was very simplistic. It was very naive. It was very idealistic, was that quintessential good life vision of, you know, a nice veggie garden, maybe some chickens with some eggs, and then a few camping spots that we'd run seasonally, and that would bring us enough income to pay the bills. That's what it looked like in my head. And we don't have the camping spots, although when people come on courses, they camp here. But, you know, that all has still actually happened. It's just magnified on a grand scale. And that's been a transition as well, that we've kind of, you know, as everything has evolved, and in part it's because of this incredible inspirational landscape that we live in, and also learning our own skills and talents. You know, Sandra isn't just a whiz at growing veg, basically in a climate, in altitude, in soils where you shouldn't be able to grow anything. You know, she's pretty much made us 100% self-sufficient in our own veg. And she runs this incredible fold of Highland cattle, rare breed pigs, hens, which produce thousands of eggs a year, hundreds of kilos of meat, carved out from this place where none of that should work. So she, you know, her skills are really, you know, embedded in that. And I guess my skills have evolved over the years as I've discovered that I quite like talking to people, and I can write and stuff like that. So all of this has grown as our skills have come out as well, which has been really cool.
And two questions really. Just one, yes. Taking a step back, would you mind for the listeners explaining what crofting is and kind of relating it to the kind of rest of the UK, better understand that? And secondly, I'm just curious, do you have any expectation for, if you know you're doing this in a very kind of environmental way in terms of producing produce, if you were doing it conventionally, do you have any expectation of how much it would produce, or how much you are above or below kind of the expected yield for the land?
No, those are both really good questions, Tom, and I'll tackle the first one to begin with. I'll try and make it as simplistic as possible, but crofting is unique to Scotland, okay? It's a unique landholding that's unique to Scotland, and not just all of Scotland, actually just part of Scotland. So the north and the west, usually, are where you will find the main, what are called crofting counties. And crofting as a landholding, in effect, came out as a result of the Highland clearances, when people were cleared off the lands and ironically replaced with sheep farming, which was seen as being more profitable at the time. So that's kind of how crofting as a landholding came about. It's a protected piece of land, and usually the average size of a croft is 5 hectares. Now we're about 60 hectares. So we're a much larger croft, and we're actually kind of on the eastern fringe of what are called the crofting counties. But crofting as a way of living is very similar to sort of small scale farming, small holding, that sort of thing. And in this part of the world, crofts are usually on what would be described in farming language as marginal land. So land that's not really what you would define as being good quality or highly productive, not improved farmland. So that's why it's all a bit roughy-tufty. It's a bit rough around the edges. So you might have a nice bit of field. People think, oh, wow, you've got 150 acres. That's incredible. You must be able to do so much. And I'm like, yeah, but like 6 hectares of that is what you would define as good, okay, in farming language. The rest is different or marginal, or, you know, whatever farming word you want to use, a lot of which I try to avoid using because I find them quite, you know, I find language is very powerful. And I find when we use words like marginal, unproductive, unimproved, we're kind of affirming a belief that it's not any good when that's actually simply not true. So it's just different to what we would see in our vision as being good farmland. So we're a large croft, but we are still a croft. But that's where it kind of blurs the line. I often switch between using the word crofting or farming, because if you know about crofting, people think it's small, but we're not small, we're big. So we kind of blur the lines. So that's what it is. And crofters, particularly traditionally, have always been good at making the most out of what they've got, working with what you've got. So turning what is poor land into actually something that is fairly productive. And generally, they've always done it spinning a number of plates at a time. So they won't just be cattle crofters. They'll have a few cows, they'll have a few pigs, they'll have a few hens, they'll maybe work off site for a few days a week. It's very kind of varied. And that's what I love about it, because it's diverse. And to me, the core of farming with nature is diversity, which doesn't necessarily just reflect in the birds and the bees in the field. It can reflect in your business model. So that's what I'd say crofting is to begin with. The second question that you asked, which I think is a really pertinent one and a really important one, is in relation to productivity. And I would answer that in relation to how we work our farming enterprises here at Lynbreck. And something that I always explain to people is that we only carry, in terms of our animal enterprises, and that's only part of what we do, but in terms of our animal enterprises, we only carry the number of animals that we believe have a regenerative impact on the land. Now, that is current. That is our real time. That will change, okay? It's been higher, it's been lower. It will go higher again, it might go lower again. Because what you're doing is you're constantly responding to, one, your base health, which is in your soil, which ideally is always incrementally increasing. But two, you're also responding to real-time events. So that could be climate events. That could be cycling of animals that you've had, whereby you think, actually, I want to now give that large area a period of rest for 2 or 3 years. So it's never static. So we only carry the number of animals that we believe have regenerative impact on the land. We took over Lynbreck 7 years ago, but Lynbreck had been farmed, we know, for at least 300 years by the original crofting family. And I would say probably chances are, I don't know for definite, but probably chances are it was continuously farmed. So it was probably continuously farmed in a way, maybe it might have been set stocked. So just, animals thrown on the land. We know it was probably ploughed at some point, improved. Again, I use that word with 2 quotation marks on either side. So we know it's had a lot of intervention. So we've taken on a land holding that, yes, has got incredible potential, but it's a landscape that's in a process of healing. And it's in the process of healing from the impact that it's had for many centuries of people working and living here. So we're at a place, I would say, that it's a transition point. It's at a healing point. So that means that as the soils heal more, as the land naturally becomes more diverse and more productive, that will then impact on the amount of animals and the amount of food that we can produce. Every single mode that we use to produce animals, so be it, mob grazing of cows in our fields, or, mob grazing of hens in our fields, or, working with pigs in our woodlands to improve diversity. Every single one has been adapted from somebody who does it on a larger scale. So scale is not the issue here. It's style, it's knowing your land, it's knowing your context, personal and environmental, but it's changeable. And so you can never give a static figure of, in this amount of years, Lynbeck will be producing this amount of food. I have no idea how much it's producing. But what I do know is 8 years ago, it was 0. Mm-hmm. And what I'm pretty sure is that, and again, I can't definitively say this, it's probably more than has ever been produced here. And we're only just getting warmed up.
What I really appreciate about what you're saying there is the kind of, I guess it's the kind of wisdom that comes with knowing the land and knowing, responding to it, listening to it, understanding the impact. And that feels like wisdom we do not have at the moment at all, in terms of being able to kind of read what it's trying to tell us. But, you've got to learn, haven't you? And you've got to learn by spending time listening and being out in the land. And I guess I was interested because you talked about this idea of kind of mob grazing, and that might be a familiar term for some of our listeners, but not for others. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of give us a description of what mob grazing involves.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you've asked that question, because again, I said earlier about I try to avoid using terms, kind of agricultural terms, because it often puts you in a box. And then I went and used an agricultural term to put us into a box. So I'm going to try and break that down a little bit so that people understand how it is that we work with our team of Lyn Cassell. So we kind of got into, whenever we took over Lynbreck, we looked at the grassland and we thought, oh, we've got to do something with it, because I think that's your natural instinct, isn't it, when you take over a bit of land. And we decided to bring on grazing animals, and we decided to work with cattle in particular, Highland cattle, because they're hardy, they're hairy, and we're in the Highlands, they're the perfect breed for the work that we want them to do. And it's in the context of looking at the work that they do, in the context of comparing them to what larger herbivores would do in the wild. So larger herds or foals would do in the wild. And, they're constantly moving. There's that threat of predators, which is always keeping them on the move. And they're pooing and peeing as they go. And just you've got that constant movement around. The fundamental part of that is that across these large landscapes is that they generally don't come back to the same place that they've been on all that quickly, because they've got these kind of large landscapes to move around. So what you're getting there, what you're factoring in naturally, is rest. And that's really the key to everything. I think it's actually, in fact, one of the things that I've learned is that it's really the key to everything in life. So you've got these large animals moving around the landscape, grazing a little bit, pooing a little bit. That's kind of helping to, that's all breaking down, feeding the soil. As it does so, you've got all these invertebrates attracted to these cow pats or herbivore pats, which are then bringing in lots of local birds. And, you see how everything's connected. So what we're trying to do on a very small scale is mimic that. So we're trying to mimic that impact and that relationship with the land, for our large herbivores and everything else. So we move the cattle in the summertime. We move them more or less, not exactly, but more or less daily. So we move them into paddocks that we create using electric fencing. We move them into a paddock, they graze there, they trample some, they dung and manure and urine, and then they move on. And so we do that repeatedly over the summer. What we're trying to look for is rest in the area that they've just moved out of. So we're trying to always increase our rest period. So I think this year we got 77-day rest period peak at one point. So that means that the area that the cattle have just come off from have had no further grazing impact for 77 days. That means that all of your wonderful grasses and wildflowers can recover. They can grow their solar panels back. Any that have seed heads on can flower and seed, and they can spring off new life somewhere else. And so that's what we're trying to do. So this kind of what is now described as mob grazing, or some people talk about it as things like holistic planned grazing, or it's got all sorts of names. That's the premise of what we're trying to follow here at Lynbreck. And I think we've seen a couple of really good things. So one is we've seen, to use the farming language, we've seen productivity and diversity in the fields increase. We're starting to see really interesting impact on local bird populations. So my favourite is the curlew. So anybody that knows anything about conservation and rewilding will know the curlew. It's a red list RSPB species, massively in decline. And I talk about at Lynbreck, we grow curlew like weeds, in that we have these really nice areas of habitat, of boggy area where they breed. And what we started to notice is as we started to use the cows in our fields, the curlew would come off the boggy areas and bring their chicks up into the fields and start to follow the cattle, because they knew that the cowpats were full of invertebrates that would then feed their young. So I've sat before in our living room and I've looked out onto the field, and we've got a track, and I've watched curlew chicks, going across the track. What we've also seen is just general kind of increase in invertebrate activity, general increase in bird activity as a result of that. So we're already seeing, after just 5 years of doing this, real-time impacts of the benefits of the cattle. And I just like to really emphasize that, because they can get a bit of a hard rap.
I think that's really interesting, because I guess one of the debates perhaps within the rewilding sphere is, what role do livestock play in helping to increase biodiversity on the land? And what I'm hearing is that the intention behind all of what you're doing is around regeneration. Yet, we've been told, you don't put anything on the land for a few years. Or some people are saying, well, what's NEPA been criticised for farming cattle as opposed to rewilding? And how do you find the balance perhaps between the dirty word of overgrazing but also the kind of the hoped for impact of increasing biodiversity as quickly as possible, given the kind of nature crisis we're in?
Yeah, I really love that question, and I love that you're bringing this up, because I think it's really interesting when we talk about rewilding in the absence of people, and we talk about rewilding in the absence of what our role is in all of this. And I remember, and things like the criticism that places like NEP have been given for farming in a way that's still regenerative. I think it kind of plays to really questioning what it is that we're trying to do with rewilding. What is rewilding really about? When I started out reading about rewilding, it was all about, right, well, you've got this kind of broken landscape. We broke it because we're the people, and we broke the landscape. And so now what we've got to do is we've got to kind of fence it, maybe plant some trees, maybe restore some peatland, and then step back. That in the good old days, I don't know what people think about rewilding now, but in the good old days, that was kind of what rewilding was. You got a bit of impact at the front, and then you just step back. And you think that's such an interesting way to look at it, because it in no way addresses the root cause of why we got into this pickle in the first place. It's funny, one of my favourite podcasters is a guy called Dr. Rangan Chatterjee. He's a medical doctor, and he's a real advocate of lifestyle changes to improve your health and well-being. And one of the things that he always talks about is, if there's anything, if there's an illness, if there's something wrong, what is the root cause? The only way you're going to, address this and heal this is get to the root cause. And the root cause of why we're needing to rewild is because of our disconnect from the land. That fundamentally is why we need to do rewilding now, or we feel the impetus to do rewilding, because as a society, as a group, as a species, we've lost our connection to the land, through the commodification of nature over a period of time, which is probably quite short. Realistically, in relation to our evolution, things have dramatically changed, and so our connection is lost. And so if we start to look at working with livestock and seeing our role in it, and seeing how we can be stewards or guides, not managers. I don't believe we can manage land, because if we try to manage land, we try to control land, and that gets into a bit of a grey area. But if we can see a role for us and using our incredible talents as the top of the tree as that we are, we're really important in that. And so I don't see that there necessarily has to be a problem with working with livestock in this form, in a way in where we are still producing food, which is fundamentally at its core regenerative. I can't see the problem personally. Others may, but that's where I stand on it.
My experience with rewilding words, it means so many things to different people. And I think, it's all about, as long as you stay true to what it means to you and what you're doing is generally beneficial, impactful for nature, then call it whatever you want and just get on with it. Let's not get wrapped around the axle about, well, this is not purist rewilding and blah, blah, blah. Because I think maybe we haven't got enough on our plate to start arguing about the nuances at that stage.
I guess on the kind of question of land management, one of the things I was particularly interested in, having read your book, is I know you've done a lot of tree planting. And again, another one of the debates that I've come across in kind of rewilding is natural regeneration versus tree planting. And I know you've had a lot of experience in that in your work in the borders as well. And I guess I'm wondering what influenced that decision and what your reflections are on that.
Yeah, really great question, Chloe. Really great question. Yeah, so massive tree hugger here. Love trees. Don't think in some form we'll probably ever stop planting trees here at Lynbreck. Yeah, I mean, I fell in love with trees back when I started working with the National Trust, which was back in kind of 2008, 2009. And I had exposure to trees in all sorts of different ways. So back in those days, it was much more kind of practical role. So I would have worked chainsaws a lot, felling trees, or I would have been surveying trees. So understanding, kind of tree fungi and diseases, or I would have been planting trees or copsing trees or all sorts of things. So I've been working with trees for lots and lots of years, writing management plans for trees, all sorts of different things. And then, yes, we went to the borders, and that was very much where we were working on large-scale reforestation. So one of the sites that I worked on, which is a kind of a flagship project, I think in the UK, is called Carafran Wildwood, run by a charity called Borders Forest Trust. And so I worked at Carafran for 2 years and saw the impact that planting has had on a landscape which was largely devoid of much of anything at all. The reasons for, or if you want to say arguments for planting in that context at Carafran, was seed source. There simply was no natural seed source. There was a lot of Sitka, but that was pretty much about it. So one of the main arguments for planting was, if we're going to get diversity back, we need to reintroduce the species that may or may not have been here at some point based on our scientific data, but are likely to thrive, bring in more biodiversity and continue into the future. Nowadays we know so much, don't we? We always know too much with climate modelling and what happened before and what's coming in the future. You always have to start with a baseline, and you'll never get full agreement on that. But that's where they started, and I think they started in the right place. So that in that situation was a really strong place for planting. Now, say in contrast to that, we live very near Abernethy Forest, which is run and managed by the RSPB, where a lot of the work is very much, there's some planting done, but a lot of it's about natural regeneration. You've got this remnants, and it's only remnants of an ancient Caledonian pine wood. Within it is lots and lots and lots of more recent planting that was planted for sort of commercial reasons, but is now part of a reserve. But you've got a seed source there of classic Caledonian pine woodland. You've got your pine, you've got your juniper, you've got your rowan, you've got your birch, and a few other bits and pieces. Solid Caledonian pine wood, seed source is there. If you can get on top of the deer, you can keep your browsing low, your seed source is there. So those are kind of two extremes of where you might sit. We've decided to take them both and do a little bit of everything. So at Lynbreck, we have some ancient Caledonian pine wood here. Tiny, tiny, tiny bit. So in some areas, that's regenerating. So in areas where it was regenerating well, we deer fenced. I don't like deer fences. They're ugly. They limit movement in the landscape, but they're very, very, very effective. So we put a deer fence around one area. It's regenerating nicely. It's regenerating at a good rate, especially with herbivore pressure down. So let's just leave that bit. But there was another area of hill ground where there was some regeneration. But there was also some really nice, really ancient woodland that included things like aspen, which is so rare in this area, and hazel. And I'm not just talking like a wee aspen whip and a wee kind of hazel whip. These were massive trees, and they were in the bottom of this gully that had kind of survived centuries of felling for shipbuilding or intensive farming. And there were these little relics that were kind of hanging on there going, we we can live here too. And so that very much influenced our mindset of going, okay, so we've got this really nice area that's regenerating, but this other area, which is also regenerating, but there's these other species. Let's look at what else could grow there. So we started to look at climate maps, we started to look at soil maps, and we started to think, do you know what? I think oak would grow here. And I think more aspen and more hazel, maybe hawthorn would grow here. What else? Bird cherry. We planted this whole melange of broadleaf species, alders as well, in and amongst this Caledonian pinewood, put a deer fence around it. And that was 6 years ago. You can now walk into that area, and the aspen that we planted are 3 meters, 4 meters in high. We're starting to see oak trees at 350 meters above sea level that are 1 meter in height. And they're not struggling. Some are, but some are doing really well. And so for me, I'm like, well, that was a good decision. Because whilst we can see it in our static vision of that should or should not grow here, if it's going to be a species that's native or non-native, but is ultimately going to give beneficial qualities, then I'm okay with that. So what we now have is this incredible diverse landscape of some regeneration, we've got some planting, but we've got diversity. And going forward, that's just going to spread.
From a practical level, just I'm thinking about what we're going to be working towards on our project.
Yes.
The areas that you fenced in for the planting purposes. Are there any herbivores on that at all, or is it just rested at the moment in that perspective?
Yeah, pretty much. There's the odd rascally hare that we'll get in now and again, and rascally rabbit. But in the main, it is herbivore. It's complete herbivore exclusion. And that is a temporary tool. You know, we both joke about how we hope to live old enough to see the day when we can open the gate and allow the cattle into that woodland, allow pigs into that woodland, you know, have them play the role of a large herbivore and wild boar within that woodland as it then grows, and they will have a role to play in how it evolves, as they would anywhere else. And that's what I really love about what we're trying to do, is that we're kind of taking these tools and we're overseeing it all. But if everything doesn't come together, then none of it works. And so we can't step out ourselves and say, and then in 20 years' time, we're never going to touch that again. We can do good things. So we should be a part of it. And we can work with our animal team to achieve that.
It's a really, really inspiring vision. And I guess it's making me think loads, and I've kind of run out of time. But I think one of the kind of other questions I wanted to ask about is more the kind of education outreach work that you're doing. You know, I'm conscious that first of all, it's fantastic what you're doing in the 150 acres, but, you know, you're trying to magnify the effects of that by inviting people and sharing your stories. And I suppose I'm wondering what's kind of influenced that, and what are your hope for kind of outcomes of that education outreach activities?
So I think there's probably a number of things that have influenced our decision to kind of go down that route to this point. I think one of the reasons has been seeing people's reaction to what it is that we're trying to do. So generally when people come here and they see it, they're totally 100% in. And I kind of see Lynbreck as a bit of a landscape of hope. You know, people come here and they go away usually feeling better than what they did when they arrived. And that's really powerful. And that's just the land doing it. That's really powerful because it kind of flies in the face of modern day fear mongering, doom, gloom, crisis, war, threat, fear. It just flies in the face of that. So one, we wanted to see if there was a way that we could use that to do our bit to making the world a better place. I think a second reason was because we enjoy doing it. So, you know, I do a lot of the public facing stuff. So I'll do the tours. We kind of tag team on the teaching on the courses. But we get a real buzz out of it. It can be exhausting. Oh my goodness. It can be so knackering. And, you know, by the end of the summer, and then, you know, especially now after a season of butchering and harvesting and all that, you're absolutely knackered. Mm-hmm. But, you know, we'll run maybe one of our 4.5-day courses. And at the end of it, you can see the impact that it's made on people. And they then go away and make their changes. And so you're taking that pebble of information, and that pebble is then going out in ripples, which are the people that have been on the course. And then they slowly make more and more waves. So seeing the way that we could make it that way, which way we enjoyed. And then the third reason for doing it was a purely business one, was finance. So, you know, to run courses, to run tours was another way for us to make money. You know, as that phrase goes, making money from old rope. We live here. We know about it. we work here. Nobody knows more about Lynbreck than we do, and nobody knows more about what we do than we do. So if we could turn that into a financial asset, then for us, that seemed like a really kind of positive thing to do.
And you've strayed into a territory that I love learning more about. It's just the commercial side of life, because these things you have to exist. You have to continue to exist. So I'm curious as to kind of finding out, and maybe this is overly commercial word, but how long did it take you to break even or move into a place where you were comfortable that you were not to be going in the wrong direction from a finance perspective?
Yeah, so I think it's an ever-moving feast, which is what we've discovered. We could probably make a lot more money if we had a lot more animals, if we did a lot more of this, that, and the other. But then it compromises our belief of, only having the number of animals that we believe have regenerative impact on the land. So we're a multi-enterprise setup. I think what's interesting about our setup, though, is that everything at the end of the day comes back to the core things that we produce, which is food. So either in our kitchen garden or our beef, our pork, our eggs and our honey, everything just simply, it's like a mushroom. It kind of spores from that. So if we haven't got any of those core things, we haven't got tours, we haven't got courses. We also have a private rental on site. We don't have everything else that we do if it's not for that core enterprise. And what we've had to try and learn, and honestly, very honestly, Tom, what we're still learning is the financial viability of it all. But what I can say to you is that, at the end of the, so far to this point, we sort of shifted into kind of really operating fully commercially from maybe like 2020, 2021. So quite recently. Yeah. Up until that point, it was kind of dribs and drabs. It would have been 2020, but then COVID hit and that kind of kiboshed a lot of stuff. So it was more kind of 2021. So what we're always trying to see is how that kind of works in the current climate. But what we've also learned, so we can do all of that. We can pay our bills at the end of the day. We eat really good food. We never go hungry. We never go cold. We have everything that we need in life, and we still have money to, go on the odd holiday and go out for dinner. So really we have everything that we need. But what we need to value more is, and I mean this kind of in a very holistic kind of social world, is the commercialization or the value of well-being. And we tend to often, and I've been so guilty of this and still can be, of looking at the spreadsheet and going, oh, we didn't make enough money, or we've got to make more money from that. And, and sometimes that is very true. And, because I'm thinking, have we got enough money to replace the truck in 5 years when it's going to die? You get into that spiral, right? And especially from our situation whereby, we've never really had, much behind us. It is very much, every year. But we need to, and as a society, really value what is holistically in all of us. And that is our capabilities and our physical and mental well-being. So as we kind of go through this journey, it's like, yeah, we could make loads more money doing that, but is that going to make me happier? And if it's not going to make me happier, then it's not going to make my business any better. It might to a finance advisor make my business look better, but if I'm not happy, that's not making my business any better. So I'm going to choose the option of just what feels good.
What I really appreciate there about is some of the courage that's needed to kind of step away from some of those dominant stories about that we need more things, that we need more money, and that is what determines success. And actually being able to be brave enough to think about, well, actually, what do I need and what do I need holistically is a really critical thing. And, having worked in a kind of mental health context for a number of years, also it really resonates with me what you're saying about the kind of disconnection from nature and how that affects not just nature, but, our own well-being. And I suppose I'm wondering, do you have any particular thoughts around how, as a society, we can help ourselves to become more connected with what is essentially part of us, which is the natural world?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question, Chloe, and I don't think it's more pertinent in our times. And I have to be honest as well, because in some ways, because of the way that I live and because of the place that we live in, sometimes I feel very disconnected from just how disconnected people are to the world. Quite honestly. Yeah. And so, sometimes I said, one of my favorite podcasters, Rangan Chatterjee, he talks so much about practical lifestyle changes to, get people to reconnect, to get people to feel better in themselves, using the power of nature, simple things like when the sun rises, go out and look at it. When, if you're kind of busy in front of your laptop every day, take a 10-minute walk in nature. Those are all minimal things that somebody who's really sort of fully in this world is advising. Now, I'm coming at it from a completely different place because I live here all the time. I'm surrounded by nature all the time, and I'm very much hands-on as well in it. But I can still become disconnected just like anybody else. I can very easily become disconnected by freaking out about a spreadsheet or by having too much in my diary. I become disconnected. It just looks different. And so whenever people ask me, kind of to your point, really, whenever people ask me about how do I make a practical difference, or how do I make a practical change, or how can I feel better in myself, I always say, well, there's kind of two things that you can do. One is look at your world. If everything in your world is perfect, then you can look at changing everybody else's. But if it's not, then just focus on yours. Don't worry about everybody else. Just focus on yours, because that's the only one that realistically you can change if it needs changing. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, if you want to do something practical, buy organic eggs. Now, I know that sounds like a really simple, tiny little thing, but what we started off first in terms of food production, apart from our own kitchen garden, was hens. And that really gave us a gateway into learning about hens as animals. If you don't have hens, get hens. Everybody needs to have hens in their life. They'll just make you feel better. But, that was our gateway into learning about keeping animals, but it was our gateway into learning about how animals are kept in the food systems that we have. And hens, chickens it's awful what we do to hens. It's absolutely abhorrent. Eggs are at the bottom in terms of our produce. They're at the bottom. They're the lowest value of what it costs. So I always say to people, if you can even just make one shift into buying organic eggs, using your money to spend the extra £1.50 to buy the organic rather than normal eggs, if you can make that change, and then you take that premise of what I said earlier, that's now perfect in your life. If you can then get everybody else to make that change and buy organic eggs, that ripple then becomes a wave. And with overnight, the power has come into the people's hands of changing the egg industry. Now, it's a really micro example of just a small practical change that people could make if they wanted to go away. And then that starts to raise all other questions in your life. So those are the two things that I would say to people. That's what you can do. But at the end of the day, it all starts with you. It only starts with you. And so don't become too overwhelmed with everything else.
I think that's really wise advice, because it's so easy when you're surrounded by all the news stories and when you start thinking to kind of sit all these different levels of, not just myself, my family, my community, my culture, my society, and you can then mind and get blown so quickly. So I think that's really wise advice. I'm going to try and hold on to, because I have a tendency to get too far.
And so one of the things I'd like to hold on to is diary being busy.
Yeah, I'm dreadful. I know.
And yes. So I think probably on the next podcast, the top of the podcast, I'm going to ask you about your diary and how we help you get less busy.
You're going to hold me to account. Interesting. Through the podcast. I'm not sure I feel like that. So appreciate your time. And I think we could probably keep talking all day. But I guess my final question is, we're here at the very much the start of our project. We
feel so naive compared to listening to you. Like, oh my God, we've got so much to learn. And
you're going to give us one piece of advice in, we're 6 months in and we've done very little to the land so far, apart from try and look at it. Okay, a little, but yeah, I guess I'm wondering what you would suggest in terms of for us to hold on to.
So I think what I would say first and foremost is the land is fine. If you're not doing anything with it, it's fine. That's okay. What you're actually really looking at is, what do we want our impact to be? What is it that we're looking to do, and where is that coming from? How are we wanting to reconnect with this piece of land? So that's the kind of questions that I would encourage you to ask yourself. But you don't need to do anything, because it's absolutely fine. Your challenge is to figure out how you can then become an intrinsic part of it in a way that is positive, that is regenerative, that is sustainable, that is enriching, that is all of those things, but in a way that's giving what it is that you need from it as well.
I like it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you both. And I genuinely wish you all the very best with your project. And you never know, one day we might make it down to visit you guys. I really fancy a bit of a road trip to visit some of our ex-students, but also to see, people like you guys who are starting to do really incredible things. So no, massive, massive respect to you, and huge good luck in what you're doing.
I don't know about you, Chloe, but halfway through that, I was already planning our road trip with our tent and when we can go up there and leave the kids with the in-laws.
I feel like the passion that Lynn has for the croft came through so clearly, and it just makes you want to go and see and experience it. How she described it as that kind of landscape of hope. Yeah, it really kind of blew me away, that description.
You can picture what you think the landscape of hope could look like from her description, but I actually think going there and experiencing it will be another level.
And I think for me, what really resonated, or I guess what really struck me, is it's the power of the story as well, because I've read the book and I'll obviously put all the details out in the show notes, which is a really wonderful read. But it's their personal journey and their personal story that really spoke to me. And I think we could do with lots of those journeys in rewilding, in conservation, and nature recovery generally, this kind of personal stories, which I guess is a little bit what we're trying to do with our podcast and documenting our journey alongside that.
So I'm curious, there's a lot we covered and there's lots of things I know that you loved about that, but what was the key takeaway? Was if you had to learn one thing from that, or take one thing away from that? Come on. I know which one it is, by the way. To you.
Oh, really? Okay. This is an interesting marital test. So if you're going to force me to pick one, I think actually, surprisingly for me, the thing that struck me the most, and I guess this was kind of connected to her reflection after 7 years into the project, is the value of rest.
Ding, 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 ding.
Really?
Yes.
Actually.
Well, rest and clearing diaries were the two things I thought you could benefit from taking away.
You know, I guess my pace of existence is generally one that is perhaps not always helpful. I really thought actually what is, in terms of her point around how nature's telling us that sometimes it needs to rest, and then through that it rejuvenates, that's really made me think about where in our lives do we have time for that rest, and what does that look like, and how that then helps us to rejuvenate. It's really helping me in my journey of trying to say no to things, which is an ongoing challenge.
It's an ongoing theoretical debate is what it is, Chloe. I live in hope that one day it will turn into action. And I think following on from your point, it is that it's all well and good being busy, but whether it's pushing in the right direction or just being busy because you've always been busy, I think is important reflection to explore. And that's not aimed at you specifically.
But even actually, because I had been aware of Lynbreck Croft and I'd been aware of the book, but obviously when we knew that the podcast was coming up, I kind of, rather than just it looking beautiful on my shelf, I took it down and really read it cover to cover. And actually that opportunity to sit and read a book properly, that's not something I'd done in 6 months, because we've been so busy. And actually it was so valuable just to have the space to immerse myself in that story and to slow down in that way. So I wanted to thank Lynn for coming on the podcast and creating that opportunity for me to really kind of revisit something. So I'm going to place the same question back to you, Tom. And I have no idea what you're going to reflect on from this interview, so I'm going to make a guess. But what was it for you that stood out?
Other than being amazing human beings and massively inspirational, it's always easy to compare yourselves, and I find us comparing our position to theirs.
Yeah.
I think my key takeaway is, like it is with everything in life, if you can help your brain to do it, is learn from them, take the key takeaways that's relevant to you, but don't try and pretend to be them. You've got to be yourself, and you've got to understand what works for them won't necessarily work for us here, and we've got to work out what our vision for like she said, to be fair, that was her key takeaway to right at the end of the interviews. Work out what is your truth. And so again, I can't believe I just remember that, but that's exactly what it is. And I think that is the key takeaway. It's find our key truth, but then once you work out what it is, really go at it.
And that's quite a hard thing to do. Like, I was busy making plans for our market garden and our chickens, and our having, feeling so inspired by the work that Lynn and Sandra are doing. But then it's hard. It's sometimes difficult to know actually what is your truth, or what is the thing that really drives you. That takes a bit of unpicking sometimes. And
I think it's okay not to know what your truth is until you have enough experience to find out what that is. And you only have built experience by doing and failing generally.
Yeah, which is a hard thing to sort of tolerate, the discomfort of failure. And for me as well, it depends a lot on the relationships you form and who comes along with you on that journey to help kind of create that shared vision. Like, it's hard to have that in isolation.
I mean, it is, but spinach, failed. Digger, wild boar, semi-failure. I'm racking up my failures pretty well.
You're a very good failure. But no, you're very good at helping me tolerate the idea of failure.
On that note,
I guess it left me feeling really excited about what we can, what conversation we could be having on a podcast in 7 years' time about what we've achieved here.
100%. So that's it for today. I hope everybody enjoyed the podcast as much as you can evidently hear that Chloe and I have. One thing I want to leave you with, if you have enjoyed this, we haven't said it for a few weeks, but it means a lot if you could just, once you finish listening to this, just get your phone out, go on to wherever you rate, either on iTunes or on Spotify, give it a review and a rate, and that has a disproportionate effect on the kind of rankings, and therefore increases the number of listeners, and hopefully other people can benefit from this. So until the next episode, I wish you adieu.
Goodbye, everybody.